Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where today I want to talk about Gremlin Graphics, or Gremlin Interactive if you prefer, as they were a prolific developer and publisher for the Amiga, and between 1988 and 1995 they managed to release over 50 games, and I think you can guess where we're going with this one. Yes, we are going to be checking all of them out, and because of how many there are, it's only going to be a mini review for each one. So let's start in chronological order in 1988, where they released just 3 games. Because at that point, they were just dipping their toes in the 16-bit market. Deflector. This was ported by Gremlin from the Spectrum, and it's a classic game and a decent port. The basics are that you need to use your laser to pop all of the balloons, which requires bouncing or deflecting the beams using various mirrors that you can turn around. But that, well, is not enough. You will also need to use the reflectors that might send the beam in wildly different directions, or teleporters, all while making sure not to cause an overload by bouncing the beam back to the emitter or hitting certain objects. And once the screen is cleared, you'll have to get the laser to the end collector. It's a fun puzzle game with some nice music, and it looks quite decent for its age. Motor Massacre. Developed by Grey Matter, Gremlin only handled the publishing of this one in Europe, as in the US it went under the name Road Raider. It's a bit of an odd game, as it's almost an open world style driving game, as you travel around, well, badly in my case, in this top down post-apocalyptic world, where it's full of people all crazy on stew, and it's up to us to try and find not only food, but also trade it for upgrades and repairs. Now, to get those supplies, we will need to head out on foot into some buildings, as we'll need to fight our way through 3 cities with their demolition derby arenas in between, all to try and take out the menace of Dr. Anoid, who has addicted what's left of humanity to his fake food. Technocop. This is another Grey Matter game, with this one being a title from Gremlin. And they must have had a thing for these dual gameplay style games, as we start off with a driving game in a very flashy car that I'm sure is not based on a real vehicle at all, and after driving down this well-drawn road that is really good for its time, as there's hills and curves and everything you'd expect later on games to have, we will eventually stop and have to get out the car and do some on-foot action. But be careful, as there are civvies around, so avoid killing them, and only take out those that want to harm you, in, well, surprisingly graphic detail. All along, your wrist comp will tell you where you got to try and go, and who it is you're trying to arrest. Oh. 1989. Well, they really did take to those newer platforms, as they released 13 games in that year. But the Amiga was never really the focus, it was just one of many. 3D Galax. Developed by Gremlin for the Atari ST in 1987, this one eventually made its way to the Amiga. Now, I don't think we need to go too far to find the inspiration for this one, from either the name or the gameplay. Now it is quite fancy a take on that classic shoot 'em up. I don't think it quite pulls it off. The frame rate is clearly nothing to write home about, and because of the way that everything moves, it's really awkward to line up the shots. It feels like you're fighting inertia than the aliens as they move around. So be very careful to pay attention to that radar at the bottom of the screen, particularly when you can only have one shot in flight at once. Artura. Another Gremlin developed game that started elsewhere. This is a bit of a hack and slash style game, with a maze-like mechanic for travelling around, as you can move left or right, but also in and out of various doorways, making it almost a 3D game, with baddies constantly swarming you, so you need to get quick at throwing those axes, as avoiding them, well, almost feels impossible. This definitely feels more like an 8-bit game than what we've seen so far. And this one ended up hitting a number of budget labels over the years, including getting re-released on a magazine as a free game, which I think gives you an idea of how well it sold or how good the quality was. Axel's Magic Hammer. With a title screen that looks like it might have been at home on the C64, this was an early core design game. And it is a platformer, but in that classic core style, not in your typical Euro platformer one. Now it's very obviously taken inspiration from the Mario games, but it's not done the movement well quite as well, as jumping is clunky to say the least, as you need to be holding the direction you want to move in as soon as you press the jump button. Pressing it afterwards will do nothing. The hammer range is also quite short at the beginning, but you can collect items to improve that, with you quickly getting the ability to throw them, and then, well, you'll find a few other bonuses along the way. Now there are 8 decently sized levels, with various degrees of bosses to deal with. Butcher Hill. What we have here is an Amagitech developed game that opens with audio that sounds, well, a little broken to be honest. I guess someone was still trying to get to grips with the Amiga hardware? Now, no prizes for guessing the setting for this game, as we have a war title, where we start with having to head down a river that looks nice enough, even if it does feel a little sluggish as we try to avoid obstacles in the water, while also trying to grab the ammo. Now when we get to the end of this, it will open up into a jungle, and a first-person style view as well. Now this is more that flip screen dungeon crawler style first person, so don't expect any smooth movement, but for a game of this age, it's quite impressive. But the shooting, well, it's a little awkward. Dark Fusion. From Spirit Software Programs, also known as ESP, here we have a bit of a platformer shooter hybrid that is extremely reminiscent of a few Spectrum games, with controls that might make you question what machine you're playing it on. I get the sense that they were trying to do really fancy collision detection, as you can barely jump over some of the barriers. But then I think they expected you to use the upgrade system to select the super jump as the very first thing, as that does make things easier. And yeah, it uses an upgrade system similar in style to shooters, which isn't all that surprising really. Particularly when it turns into a horizontal shooter. Federation of Free Traders. This appears to be another internally developed game that has taken some very obvious inspiration from Elite. As in, it looks almost exactly and moves exactly like Elite, just with more filled in graphics. But it's not a complete copy, and you will need to look around the manual to work things out, as this is not a simple game. But it does have a simple language, as you can open up the computer to code snippets in a basic style simple language. I think it's fair to say that most of the game is a little overcomplicated. To land on a planet, you first have to dock at a space station before you can then attempt a landing, at which point it will switch to another view. It's a title full of interesting ideas, they're just not implemented well enough. Footballer of the Year 2. A sequel to the 8-bit only game that was also developed by Gremlin in 1986, with this one landing on both the 16 and the 8-bit machines, as yeah, there was still a market for those. Now this is some form of football management sim that lets you pick a Super League team, which means it's a mix of various UK leagues, and graphically, well, it's also a little bit mixed, with some attempts at animations that only seem to slow things down. Now your actions are done via goal cards that you have to buy, which will allow you to set tactics that you will have to actually play out yourself in this top-down view, or you can just use no cards at all and hope your team does well without you. Hostile All-Terrain Encounter, also known as Hate, is another game that hit multiple platforms, with the Amiga version being a port from the ST. Based on the messages left by the developer in the code, they didn't seem too happy to have to finish up this one and handle the work on someone else's port. And what we have ended up with is a shooter, but done in that isometric forced perspective viewpoint, similar to Sega's Zaxxon. It is also, like that, an auto-scroller, with the joystick moving the craft up and down as well as to the sides. You cannot push forwards or back. And, well, you've also got a fire button. And as always with these types of shooters, trying to work out your vertical height tends to be a bit of a problem. And then trying to avoid everything becomes more difficult after that. John Lowe's Ultimate Darts. A Wise Owl developed game, and I don't think there's any doubt at all that Gremlin published this one. I guess if you have that empty space you might as well put it to some use. Now this darts game has multiple game modes, from tournaments with various levels including pub darts, that when you play, well, it does seem like you've already had a few, with that weaving dart on the screen. But then this isn't the easiest sport to recreate and make interesting, as if you could just aim wherever you want, that would just make it easy. You also have the other modes that are interesting enough with their own sets of rules and what you need to aim for at the time. Mickey Mouse the Computer Game. A kid's licensed property that wasn't all that common for Gremlin, and playing as Mickey we have to travel our way up the tower, using either our water pistol or hammer to take out the enemies, as we want to try and find the doors, as our goal is to board them up. Now this will require using a key and then playing a mini game. Now that might be popping bubbles before they can destroy the randomly moving walkway, or having to walk around this large maze trying to find the parts that we will use to close up that door for good. It's not exactly the best looking game that we've seen, and I wonder if this was always a Mickey Mouse game. But it does have an interesting mechanic where our health is also our ammo for the water pistol. Mindbender. A game that in early previews was also known as Deflector 2, and I think it's easy to see how this could have been a sequel to that game, although I'm not sure why they renamed it. Now more effort has gone into making the game feel more like it's got a personality of its own, with the laser being fired by a wizard, and little people holding the mirrors that bounce the beam around. We also now have mouse support, which makes it much easier and faster to play. But then they must have worked that out with some of the levels, as they can end you very quickly if you're not paying attention. As it took me a while to work out that you could also rotate the wizard around. Some of the levels also have mirrored walls that will send the beam in all sorts of fun directions. Overall, I think it's a good take on the original, with more sound effects and graphical touches. Super Scramble Simulator. An early magnetic fields game that I have to assume helped set up a very successful relationship between the two companies, as we will be seeing more of their games later. Now this feels like it was inspired by what Codemasters were doing at the time, or at least how they were naming their games, as we end up with a side-on motorbike game that looks very similar to the likes of Kickstart or ATV Simulator. But this is far more picky with what gear you're in and how fast you're meant to be going, as it's very easy to fly over a ledge and then break a wheel, or stop too quickly and damage your brakes. Now changing gears is a bit of a pain, as you have to hold the fire button and then press up and down, and there's no auto mode here. Now while this isn't the best sounding game, I do think it's a real looker, with some lovely parallax scrolling going on in the background. Switchblade. Another game by Core Design that shows a bit of the flair and style we would come to recognise from them, as this doesn't follow that typical platforming run and gun tropes of the time. Instead, they made something a little different, even if that isn't obvious from the start. The levels are huge, but can also feel claustrophobic as well, as they will slowly expand as you move around, as you can't see rooms unless you've gone into them. It's a bit of a cross between the scrolling levels and the flip screen style of the 8-bits, and the combination of the two is really interesting. With 5 levels to explore with all sorts of nooks and crannies to check out, it is an interesting game, even if it does have a bit of an odd combat system. "1990. Well, a little bit of a step down with just 9 games, but they were starting to take the 16-bit more seriously, with more titles being developed for it first than for the 8-bits. Not to say there weren't still games coming out for those machines, and amazingly we start to see the Amiga being the lead platform for a few of them. BSS Jane Seymour, or as it was also known as Federation Quest 1, BSS Jane Seymour, or Shipwrecked 14 billion light years from Earth. I guess they were planning to make a whole series of these, which is fair to think seeing how popular the dungeon crawler genre was, as this follows that style, but rather than fantasy, it's obviously a sci-fi setting. And we don't have a party either, it's just us, whoever we choose to be, as there are a few options. The interface is a simple mouse-driven system, with a slightly less complex movement box than I've seen in some games, but it all works quite well for picking up objects, interacting with the environment, and then trying to explore the Jane Seymour as you try to fix up all the systems, and defend yourself against the robots. Combo Racer. This comes again from Imagitech, and you won't be surprised to find out that this is a racing game, but it has a twist, and that is it's a bike with sidecar racing game that is presented in the behind the bike view. Now this moves quite quickly and looks nice enough with all the hills and curves and everything else that's going on, even if the road doesn't have that alternating lines, so you have to look at the side of the screens to get that sense of speed. The addition of the sidecar does change the handling somewhat from a regular racing game, but I'm not sure it's enough to really make you think it's a completely different style of game, at least in single player, as the computer is handling the job of the second pillion rider. If you're playing in 2-player mode, then that job is handled by the other player, which could be quite interesting. Gary Lineker's Hot Shot, or as it was also known in other regions, Litty's Hot Shot. This is quite clearly a football game that they figured they needed something to make it stand out, so they licensed the English Crisp advertiser to raise its profile, and to, well, just about the right height so you can see a top-down pitch. But it's one that's large enough that it has to scroll in multiple directions for you to see the whole thing. Now the pitch itself is a little dull, both graphically and with its colour choices. And many of the actions, well, they're also automated, like goal kicks. And I think even most of the players. It's only when one of them gets the ball that you get a chance to take over. Otherwise, you're just sort of stuck with the player off screen. And it doesn't matter which half you're playing, you're going to always be shooting down the screen. Greg Norman's Ultimate Golf Shark Attack. We get another game that has a licensed name. This time it's golf, where we get lots of icons to select from, as well as a view of the course itself. Now there's far more options than you might expect. In some ways this is more micropose golf than PGA. But it does have its own take on the swing meter, as when you take a shot you have to hold the mouse button to set the power, but then as soon as you release it the bar will come flying down, and the closer it comes to the bottom the less power you'll end up having. So you'll want to click again as quickly as possible, all while making sure that meter that's swinging around is as close to the middle as possible. Impossible. Another core designed game. And is it me, or does this one have some real hints of Rick Dangerous? Which I guess shouldn't be too much of a surprise, as they had just released Rick 2 that year. And that music? It has no right going this hard. Not for the game that we get, as this is the most typical platformer that you can imagine. And it's one that has a very limited hit range for our returning character Monty Mole. Graphically it's serviceable, if a little basic in places, but there are some nice touches. There's thunderclouds that will darken the level when it attacks, but we also get some upgrades, from the soup cans that will increase our strength to the odd weapon that will last for just a limited amount of time. The levels are large and actually have more to them than you might expect, as you can actually go off screen in some of the areas. Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge. The first in the legendary games by the Magnetic Fields, and from the start it was showing the style and presentation the series was known for. From the simple but workable menu to the fancy music selection screen. Yeah, it's riffing on Outrun, but it does it so well. The gameplay is a little different from what you might expect if you played other arcade races, as this isn't a time trial, it's a straight up race against other cars, and you'll have to worry about fuel, something the AI obviously doesn't have to as well. When racing single player, you might feel a little shortchanged as you only get half the screen to play with the rest being the garage for the other player. It was the fastest, smoothest and most playable racer on the Amiga at the time. Skids. Core continuing to pump out the games this year, but they were trying something a little bit different and getting away from their platformer focus. As we get to select between a bike and a skateboard, and then do the most extreme sport ever, litter collecting. As what we have here is a bit of a collect 'em up, as we need to find the rubbish and then put it in the bin, with the 75% collection rate being required to finish the level. The controls take a little bit to get used to, as you tap the fire button to increase your speed and then hold it down to keep that speed. And then you have to push the bike or board around, as it doesn't snap to the direction that you're pushing. It's one of those games that I can get what they were trying to do, as they didn't want it to feel like you were just walking around, but at the same time it does feel a little bit awkward instead. Supercars. Magnetic Fields were not wanting to be outdone by Core, so they got another game out this year. But they, being more true to form, developed another car game. with the level of polish and presentation that we really are coming to expect from this company. From the slick main menu where you can select your car or visit the garage, to the racing itself, which this time is top down. But it's not just a single screen, we get larger maps that have to scroll around. And at first this might seem like a decent if simple enough racing game, but it opens up after you finish a race as you get a bit of cash to splash. On either fixing up the car, as it will require some servicing, but also on upgrades. But the big ticket items are the forward and rear firing missiles. That makes it a far more interesting title. Venus the Flytrap. This, by all accounts, was the first internally developed Gremlin game that was started on the Amiga. And I guess they must have been feeling the pressure from the other studios as they went all out with an intro as well. Although it is interesting that after all that effort, they ended up making an arcade-style shooter. It even has you inserting credits. Now I will say it's slightly more methodical than your typical horizontal shooter as you walk around the level, shooting the robo-critters and hoping they might give you a good upgrade. Now that might take in the form of various different weapons, but you do have to be careful as you have limited ammo for all those that aren't the normal gun. And with 50 levels, there is a lot of game to play here. It's cool that we're not flying around in a regular spaceship, and they start to mess around with gravity later on as well. (1991). It's another 9 games, but interestingly to see, the Amiga and its fellow 16-bits were becoming the focus. Oh, and the sequels are really starting to flow now. But there was one other big thing from Gremlin this year, and that was the launch of the GBH label, or the Gremlin Budget House. These, unsurprisingly, were how they released their cut-priced re-released games. But it's not just their own titles, but they also publish a few other companies as well. Now I'm not going to cover these in too much detail as this video is already way too long, but I thought it was interesting to bring it up. First Class with the Shoe People. This was Gremlin's attempt at getting into the educational market, with the First Class being the label for it. But this must not have done as well as they hoped, as this was the only game in the series. And yes, this is based on that animated TV show of the same name. If you don't know it, then don't worry, you're not missing out. Now there's 6 activities across the 2 discs, and it brings the typical level of edutainment that you've come to expect. From picking the right objects, recognizing numbers, spelling, or even the age-old colouring book. Now the art is decent and there's some nicely done animations. Hero Quest. The first of a few board games that Gremlin converted to the computers, and with most licensed games from them, it hit multiple platforms to try and recoup those costs. And at first glance, this might seem similar to many party-driven RPGs, as you can select 4 characters and their equipment, and then select one of 14 quests to undertake. But the gameplay is done on an isometric map, with the Dungeon Master watching over us at all times. Each member of your party takes their turn in order, and the interface does make this all quite quick and easy to do, particularly when you come to battling, as you'll find orcs and other nasties that you'll have to fight, with the challenge growing as you continue through the quests. And this must have done well enough that they even released an expansion pack for it. Lotus Turbo Challenge 2. Magnetic fields are back, with what many class as the peak of the series. The level of presentation has been increased and we get some all-time classic music, with some lovely looking graphics and improved menus. And the gameplay, well, it's now full screen when you play single player, but there's still the split screen 2-player mode if you want. The championship style gameplay though is now gone. It's a pure arcade racer where it's just you against the clock. So there's no need to get out in front and pit and refuel. You just have to avoid the traffic and go as fast as possible to hit those checkpoints. As you race across multiple levels with their own obstacles, from pea soup fog to the twilight night, this is an absolute classic. Pegasus. An Optimus developed game that I feel might be slightly overlooked these days. Now, what type of game do you make when you have a knight flying on a horse? Well, it has to be a horizontal shooter, obviously, but a very technically impressive one. Just look at how much parallax scrolling is going on in the background, and everything moves at a decent pace as well. This is no slouch. Now, collecting the gems allows you to select different weapons, with there being some really powerful ones if you collect enough of them. But before you know it, we're on foot, and we have to do the same thing, but now it's a hack and slash style platformer. It's an interesting mix, and I feel this game really should be talked about more. As while it's not particularly groundbreaking, it does everything so well, and just looks great doing it. Supercars 2. Magnetic Fields were all about the sequels this year, with this one being proudly sponsored by Early Drive, and Woolwich, and Brands Hatch, as you can never have too many sponsors obviously. Now this in many ways has been simplified from the first game, from a far more basic main menu to having just a single damage meter on the HUD, but the tracks are bigger and more complex with jumps. We also have missiles right from the start, but so do those computer controlled cars, and they will fire them quite happily at you and the other racers, which makes for a change with them only targeting us. And to break up the gameplay, there's now these odd moments where you have to answer questions. Suspicious Cargo. An Imagitech and Exile production, and this is the game featuring John Haynes. Who is this person? I don't know, but I feel that they were trying to do the whole Lara Croft thing long before Tomb Raider, as this is an interesting take on a text adventure, where you can just type in what you want to do, or you can use the panel at the side to build up your commands, which gives you the added benefit of letting you know what's actually around you all via the UI. Now you get to move around with the controls at the bottom of the screen, which will do the typical text adventure thing telling you what's around you as you move. But as you interact with people and objects, you'll also get pictures, even some full screen animations. The interface can also be customized to suit, so you can stick with just the text interface if you prefer. Switchblade 2. Yes, we're getting another sequel, but this is a bit of an interesting one, as while the first game was developed by Core, Gremlin took this one in-house, and the result is a game that, well, mostly feels like the original, but it looks more like a 16-bit title, with some nice animated touches going on while you're topside. And then when you get underground, it still has that limited visibility system in place. The combat system has also been tweaked, with the charge system being mostly removed. You now simply sword attack people, or if you get weapons later on, you can use those. But you'll have to collect weapons to get your extra guns. And while the original was mostly underground, here we get more outside sections. Not that you'd know it from the first level, which follows the original very closely. Team Suzuki. It's a big year for licensed racing games from Gremlin, as we get this fully 3D rendered bike racing simulation, if that wasn't obvious from the name. And in-game it is very impressive, if a little slow on the target hardware, but considering how much it's drawing, that is to be expected. There's even nice little animations on the biker's hands when you apply throttle or brakes. Now there's a number of tracks for you to race across in either a single race or via a whole season, and they must have been considering an expansion pack as they have a button for loading in extra tracks, but I couldn't find any evidence of them actually releasing that. Now like with quite a few other bike sims, you get to play this either via the joystick, or if you want more fine-grained controls, you can use the mouse. Toyota Celica GT Rally. Yep, it's another licensed racing game. This time it's Rally, and they've gone with Toyota. Well, and pretty much anyone else's logo that they could have plastered all over this game. And they went with a bit of a mixed style with the graphics, as the tracks and buildings are 3D rendered, but they're using sprites for the things like trees, which makes sense as you want more detail in a rally game, as you want to be travelling down these fast roads, all while trying to avoid the obstacles. And obviously you gotta have your co-pilot giving you your directions, not just in text, but via voice samples. And on top of all of that, they went all out with the weather effects, and other touches that go along with it, like having to turn on your wipers to clear your screen, with the race conditions changing massively with the weather. Utopia: Creation of a Nation. Gremlin are dipping their toes in the God City Builder sim genre with this absolute classic game that started off on the Amiga before hitting machines like the SNES of all things. And in this isometric style game, we have to build a civilization on an alien planet and try and get them to Utopia by raising their quality of life. This means placing buildings. So many buildings! But they all have a use, from air to food to entertainment. Oh, and don't forget power and housing. Now obviously we are not alone here, so you're gonna have to build up an army and then send them off screen to fight. This one also got an expansion pack, The New Worlds, a year later. (1992), a slightly slower year as they were looking towards quality over quantity, because the consoles, well, they were starting to become far more important. But this is also the year a few all-time classics really show up. Harlequin. A game by the Warp Factory, a name that we will hear from again. This is an extremely stylish game that is part regular platformer and part Metroidvania. As it's not quite as involved as most Metroid games, but it does require quite a bit of backtracking across the various maps to try and find switches that will open up even more levels, as our goal is to find the heart pieces and to bring this world back to life. This is a world full of weird and wonderful creatures that we'll have to take out with our hearts. There's also power-ups that let you float, bounce, or even swim, but I will say the controls do take a little bit to get used to. Now, there was also a plan to turn this into a licensed game based on the band Madness when they started a Mega Drive port. Lotus 3: The Ultimate Challenge. Magnetic Fields are back again with Lotus. Now, this one is my personal favourite of the series, as it combined the best bits of 1 and 2. If you want the time trials of 2, then you can do that. If you want the championship style with the pit stops, well, you have that option as well. And on top of that, we also get new environments, which includes the weird futuristic one with the speed boosters. But we also now have Rex, a system that you can provide a seed and it will generate a brand new track for you to race on. Or you can use various sliders to define the type of track that you want. Now, it's not a full-on track editor, but this is still very cool, as it does mean we have almost unlimited tracks, and it's a perfect end to an amazing series. Nigel Mansell's World Championship. We go from one racing game to another, which was also licensed, but this time it's from a sporting personality, something we've not seen in a little while. And while playing these two racing games back to back, you do feel the difference in its handling. Now, from screenshots it might appear to be a reskinned Lotus, but in practice it's all its own. This is also the first game that we've seen that got an upgraded AGA and CD32 release. With 16 tracks, there is a lot to learn, as you play across reasonable recreations of famous tracks. And if you don't know the tracks, then you have Nigel Mansell here to guide you through them, with his disembodied head giving you advice, while showing you the racing line. On top of all this, there's a full racing season with point scoring that you would expect, as well as single races. Plan 9 from Outer Space. The first game from the Gremlin Ireland team. And yes, this is based on that famously bad cult classic Ed Wood film, and some copies of the game even came with the film on VHS. Now, the first thing that will hit you is the tiny area of the screen that the action takes place in, with the rest mostly being a border that holds the verbs and shows you the text of what people are talking about. This does feel like a bit of wasted space here, really. Now, rather than being a retelling of the movie or trying to recreate it, this is instead a story about the film or how it's been stolen, and we have to go out and try and find the film reels, and then we have to restore the film back to its original glory. Which is an interesting take for a licensed title. Space Crusade. The licensing continues, and this time it's the sister game to Hero Quest. But it's not just a reskin of that game. This is a completely different game. Okay, initially you still have to pick your squads and then load them out, but after that it does get different when we select the missions that we want to go on, as we'll have to move our various Space Marines in turn as we attempt to complete the mission that we are given. Now the basic movement and attacking is all done through this top-down view, with there being a line of sight mechanic as well, limiting how much we can see what's going on around us. But then when we attack, it switches to this isometric style 3D view. Now typically the missions will be take out a single unit and then try and get back to the starting point. And I have lost count how many times I've attempted and failed this first mission, but I do keep coming back to it. Video Kid. This Twilight developed game ends our run of licensed titles, and after a few brainy and more simulation style games, we crash back into the arcades, with what surprisingly turns out to be a shoot 'em up, but a multi-directional shooter where the scrolling will lead you around the level, as the Video Kid has to take out enemies while avoiding lots of traps, even on this first level. And this is quite a lovely looking game, with a high level of presentation, as there's some nicely animated bits between the levels, all while we fly around these various different styles, that are all based on movie genres, as the Video Kid, Billy, was sucked into a TV while playing his VHS tape, but thankfully he has a range of weapons and smart bombs that he can use. Zool, the ninja from the nth dimension. We get to one of the big ones from Gremlin, which started on the Amiga before being ported to everything. It's the fast collect 'em up Euro platformer with the alien, not an ant-based hero. And while it wasn't a licensed game, it was sponsored by Chubba Chubs, which makes for an odd and limited integration, with it mostly showing up on the first world. Now the game requires you to collect a set percentage of items to open up the exit, so exploring and trying to break open objects is required. And if you're very good, you might even find the odd super bonus, as you run around at top speed, trying to jump, spin and punch your way through everything that shows up. The levels are varied and creative, with enemies and even checkpoints being themed. (1993), and a very slow year from Gremlin on the Amiga, as they released just 4 games, and 2 of them, well, they were released at the start and end of the year, and they were from the same franchise. It's not often you get to see a sequel in the same year as the original. Disposable Hero. Boys Without Brains brings us this horizontal shooter that was an exclusive to the machine, and it is a bit of a looker. Even if it's not the fastest shooter I've ever played, it does suffer a bit from being a Euro shooter with the difficulty level being very high. There is thankfully a health bar, which never lasts long enough though. The upgrade system is also quite unique, as first you have to collect blueprints that will require time to unlock, and then once that's done, you can then land at a dome to edit the loadout of your ship. But you can't just attach everything, you have to consider how much power you have and how much the upgrades require. And if you want to give this one a go, check out the CD32 release, as they didn't really add much, but they did rebalance the difficulty. Premier Manager. The football management sim by Realms of Fantasy. Not the first football management sim that we've seen, but it is a very well done one. With a simple but effective interface for building up your team and playing matches, even if the matches are very simply reproduced. Don't expect sensible World of Soccer matches being played out here. Just a basic bar and some text, but enough to give you an idea of what's going on. But in a bit of a break from the norm, this has multiplayer support built in, letting 4 players take part, with you each taking it in turn to try and take your first division team up through the leagues. Just remember that you also need to upgrade your stadium as well as balance the books, as if the cash doesn't keep flowing, you will be kicked out of the job. Premier Manager 2! Wait, what? The sequel, also made by Realms of Fantasy, was released in the same year? Well, yes it was. And this is an interesting one, as in many ways it feels like they improved on just about everything from the original. But they did make one major downgrade. This is now only 2 players. Now I used to play this and the previous one with mates, and we worked out a little trick with the scouts, as while they might have been limited by their own skill with what they could look for, so for example you could look for a poor shooter and they would find you a good goalie. And as long as you paid them more than enough, and you kept winning, then the club didn't really care that you were massively in debt. But you do have to be careful, as they can be injured quite badly or even killed. I had one struck by lightning. Zool 2. The ninja has returned, but with the Warp Factory handling development duties rather than Gremlin themselves, and this has resulted in a slick and polished looking platformer that included a new playable character, Zeus. And it wasn't just for looks. While they play mostly the same, just with Zeus having a whip and Zool having his fists, they both use projectiles to attack. But every so often you will find blocks that only one of them can break, forcing you to go down different routes. Now this isn't as fleshed out a mechanic as you might like, but it does make the game more interesting. The collect 'em up nature of the game was retained for better or worse, with you now having to hit 99 to finish the level. Also retained was the sponsorship, which is now featured all through the game rather than just the first level. (1994), and things are picking up a little as we get more games, but once again it's a year dominated by the sequels. But it's also the year we see Gremlin Graphics become Gremlin Interactive, as they thought it sounded more professional. Hero Quest 2 Legacy of Sorasil. After 3 years a sequel finally comes along, and it's one you have to wonder if it was always planned to be a follow-up, or if they just added the license near the end. They stuck with the isometric style, but the world is now far more grander than before. And after hitting all of the main home computers previously, this was Amiga only. There wasn't even a DOS port. Now you can build up your party of 4 out of 8 predefined characters, but you can tweak and customize them before starting, and you then have 9 large maps to attempt. The interface got completely changed up, with those large arrows at the bottom for movement. Now direct attacking is easy enough, but using the spells can be tricky if you don't know how to select them. And interestingly, you have both movement and action points, which allows for some nice tactics. K240. This is a game by Gremlin, and in many ways is a bit of a sequel to Utopia, as it's what you'd get if you took a city builder style game and then moved it to asteroids where you also had to mine for ore. And placing buildings is easily enough done through this isometric view, and then they will take time to construct, with it all happening in a sort of real time. We can take that ore that we mined, and there will be different amounts on each asteroid, and then either sell it for much needed credits, as everything costs money, or we can use it to build ships and missiles, as you didn't expect this to be a friendly sector of space, did you? This is an amazing 4X style game, and is an early example of the genre. Little Divil. Developed by Gremlin Island, in respects to the Amiga, this only got released for the CD32, which makes it a little bit special. And it's clear why this was aimed at the CD hardware, as with its lovely drawn screens and animations, they needed the space. And when you eventually get past the troll that's guarding the bridge, we find a 3D maze, or at least a 3D animated maze. The actual layout is still mostly 2D, and this is effectively an adventure puzzle game, where we have to explore the dungeon to find items, and the puzzle screens, which we'll then have to work out how to beat. This might be insecticide on a spider, or a bucket of water on a firemouth. You can think of this as a more interactive Dragon's Quest. Premier Manager 3! Realms of Fantasy were not content with releasing 2 management sims, they had to release a third one just a year later. But this might be the smallest upgrade so far, when it comes to the menus anyway, as it has all been touched up more so for the AGA version, but you can still see the bones of Premier Manager 2. The main upgrade was the actual football matches, as these are now simulated in far more detail, as we can actually see what's going on. But you still have all the regular parts from the previous games, like upgrading your stadium or placing sponsorship boards. There's just a few more options than there were before. A full-priced editor for the game was released in the form of the multi-edit system, which allowed you to keep the game up to date with changes to the other teams all through the year. Now that was eventually bundled together with 3 for the deluxe edition. Top Gear 2. Now you might be wondering, where was Top Gear 1? Well, that never got released for the Amiga. That was a SNES only racing game, where the sequel hits a few platforms. And while you might think this is Lotus, it was apparently developed by a completely different team. And also surprisingly, this isn't a license from the TV show of the same name. They're completely separate. Now in a way this feels like a mix between Lotus and Supercars, as you can drive around like Lotus, but you have upgrades like Super. but it's not the smoothest racing game even with AGA hardware, but it does look quite nice with some nice detailed sprites for the cars and the odd speech bubble giving it a bit of personality. And if you look around the slightly cluttered HUD, you might notice the N icon. This is the nitrous boost, which can come in handy when you want to try and get past the rest of the pack. $1995? Well, it was the end of Gremlin on the Amiga, and they released just a single game. But they went out with a fight with Shadow Fighter. Shadow Fighter. A Naps team-developed game that is possibly one of the best beat-em-ups on the Amiga, that managed to capture the Street Fighter feeling and spirit more than any other attempt, as there's a decent range of characters that all play differently from each other. But it does suffer a little in the single player mode, as it can be a little bit difficult at times. But that was a similar complaint to many other games at the time. But they did a great job of trying to fit the entire moveset into a single fire button, and it looks just great on both original and AGA hardware, with it all moving nice and smoothly, with a whole bunch of animated characters and backgrounds. It even has a few of its own cool ideas, like Papaz, the training special mode where you get to fight against a puppet. And wow, that was a lot of games. I hope you enjoyed that, as I had a lot of fun replaying some of those classics. And if there's any other developers or publishers you'd like me to check out, then let me know in the comments. And also, a massive thanks for getting it this far. And I also must give a huge thank you to my amazing Patreons, who got the chance of watching this a whole week early and advert free, as well as bear to see their name on the screen, and let's not forget all the behind the scenes info that they also get. So if any of that sounds cool to you, then you can join them for free. And until next time, I was the Goldfish, that was more licensed games than I was expecting, and this was Goldfish on Games.